Hello and welcome to June's Bookorama. I'm June Thomas, and I am very late to tell you about my February 2025 reading. It's the middle of May as I'm recording this, but I read some great books and I don't want to miss the chance to yak about them. As I think I say every single time I do a reading video, I don't have physical copies of many of the books that I'll be talking about, since I often listen to audiobooks that I've borrowed from the library. But I will put a picture of the cover on the screen somewhere so you can see just how lovely some of these books are. Note that I said some. Okay, let's get on with it. I read 9 books in February, 5 by male authors, 2 written by women, and 2 anthologies. 7 were non-fiction and 2 were works of fiction. 3 were biographies and 2 were biography adjacent. The first book I read in February was Women's Hotel by Daniel Lavery. And here I should disclose that Danny and I worked together at Slate, and he blurbed my book, A Place of Our Own, 6 Spaces That Shaped Queer Women's Culture. And I'm very grateful for that. But regardless, Women's Hotel is a really great book. It takes us to the Biedermeier, a Manhattan residential hotel for women in the 1960s. And apologies for yet another digression, but even though it will reveal me to be very old, I must tell you that I stayed at such a hotel, the Barbizon Hotel for Women, on my first visit to New York in 1980. I was in the city on my own and I'd read The Bell Jar, and although I was slightly disappointed because I didn't bond with the American friend circle of my dreams, I'm very glad to have this anecdote to relay, even though I recognise that it's very weak tea since I can't really remember much from the experience. Anywho, back to Women's Hotel. It isn't a plot-driven novel, but rather an interconnected series of stories and sketches of the women who lived in the Biedermeier. I really enjoyed it, and thinking back more than 3 months after I finished it, there are a bunch of things that have stuck with me over that time. One is the notion of moving day. Back in the period when the book is set, and for many years before then, there was one day or weekend when everyone moved. That was when everyone's lease came to an end, and it was a sort of all-change period. The really crazy thing is that having spent my whole life not knowing about moving day, a short while after reading Women's Hotel, I read the excerpt from Yoni Applebaum's book Stuck that was in The Atlantic, and it also had a section about moving day. What are the chances? Anyway, the other episodes that embedded themselves in my memory from Women's Hotel include the account of a resident who is an alcoholic, the presentation of her sudden fall into addiction, the way her parents responded, her recovery, and the way that even in recovery her relationship with her parents was changed by her alcoholism is something that will stick with me for a long time. Another was a character who maintained a constant correspondence with her sister, a correspondence that helped her figure out so much about her life. It helped me realize how much we have lost in losing the habit of letter writing. Danny's a great writer, and Women's Hotel was a really compelling read. The second book I read in February was Lives for Sale, Biographer's Tales, edited by Mark Bostridge. This was a really fantastic collection of short pieces from biographers talking about the challenges they face doing their job. Everyone loves a bad job story, and they are somehow even more delicious when the bad bosses, in a way, are eminent figures. Of course, not every piece was about how hard it is to write a biography, but this is one of those books that make it seem like a miracle that any book appears in the world. Reading this book also added a lot of titles to my TBR pile. The number 3 book in the number 2 month was a biography of the number 1 entitled, let's just say narcissist, in a government that is absolutely packed with them, Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson. Objectively, this is not a good biography, but I must admit that having read it, I do feel that I have a better picture of the subject and his many, many issues. There is something that is slightly, ever so slightly, admirable in his ability to get things done. Some of his achievements are objectively impressive, but it's important to note that pretty much all of them were possible because he simply chooses to ignore rules, which is to say laws as well as norms, because he doesn't believe they apply to people like him. Übermenschen really are the worst. A Katie Royfey piece in the New York Times led me to the next book on my list, Janet Malcolm, The Last Interview and Other Conversations, which is, you'll never guess, a collection of interviews. Malcolm is probably the author I have reread most often, more even than Joan Didion or Martin Amis. I really am fascinated by her work. This book helped me realise that there was a piece of Malcolm's bibliography that I had not yet read, a failure that I remedied soon enough, which we'll be hearing about soon. Malcolm was one of those people who insisted on doing interviews by email. A control thing, obviously, but if you want the interview, you go along with her restrictions. And I'm really glad that these interviews happened. But it does have the effect of placing the interlocutor in a more prominent position. I've done a lot of interviews in my time, many of which were run as Q&As rather than as written through profiles. And when I was getting them ready to appear, I would always do what I could to minimize my presence. The subject is the person people want to read about. They want to hear their words, not the interviewers. But in correspondence, which is effectively what these email-style interviews are, the questioner's responses and explanatory comments become much more central. That isn't a criticism, by the way, just an observation. The next book I read was another reflecting my recent obsession with the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Stakeknife's Dirty War by Richard O'Raw, yet another look at the British Security Service's infiltration of Northern Ireland's paramilitary groups and how that shaped the conflict. O'Raw was involved in Republican politics, but this reads like a journalistic account of events. As I've said before, there seems to be very few bad or even mediocre books about the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland. This one was one of the very many good ones. Next, I read The Silent Woman by Janet Malcolm, her look at the marriage between Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. One thing that came out of my reading of this book, along with Diane Middlebrook's Her Husband, which I read the next month, March, was that my perception of Hughes improved. I now realise that I had lazily tagged him as a sort of evil, cheating puppet master, some of which might be true. Even as someone who has read several biographies of Plath, this book gave me a more rounded and more positive sense of Hughes's role in creating the Sylvia Plath we know today. Plath and Hughes played essential roles in each other's successes. I had known that Plath brought her quite American attitude to Hughes's work. She pitched him, she worked on sort of professionalizing his submissions process, but he helped her too. I have to say that also my ears always perk up when a working class northerner, which Hughes absolutely was, has the kind of charisma and personal appeal that makes women and men from every kind of background, low-key and sometimes high-key, obsess about him. That is quite a gift. And here I will note that another working class northern man who had a great appeal across class lines was Jimmy Savile. So not saying it's good, just saying it's interesting. The next book I read in February was In Search of J.D. Salinger by Ian Hamilton, which is a great book to read if you want to change your mind about how it would be great fun to write a biography. It's kind of a theme this month. I had two big takeaways from this book. The first was that Salinger was a first-class jerk, and his jerkitude started when he was Holden Caulfield's age. The second is that things don't always work out the way they would in a just world. Hamilton presents himself in a very British way. He's kind of a guy with a lot of gifts who could try harder but chooses not to. This book turns into a legal case, really the story of a legal case, when Salinger sued Hamilton's publishers to prevent them from publishing his private correspondence. If the 2000 election taught us anything, it's that judges can make bad decisions and those judgments can cause a lot of trouble for a lot of people. I will concede here that the consequences of Bush v. Gore may have been slightly more devastating than J.D. Salinger versus Random House, but still pretty bad nevertheless. I had read a lot of non-fiction books in a row at this point, and I was craving some fiction, so having enjoyed James Atlas's book The Shadow in the Garden back in January, which was in part about his travails writing Saul Bellow's biography, I thought I would read some Bellow, a thing I hadn't done since college. Herzog, the book I chose, was a weird one. The first 2/3 or so consist of a lot of disordered thinking and imagined correspondence and score settling. I did like that there was a character called June in this book, but I don't think I'll be returning to Bellow at any point soon. Finally, the 9th book I read in February was Jan Morris's Heaven's Command, the first part of her trilogy about the history of the British Empire, from Queen Victoria's accession to the death of Winston Churchill. All I can say about this book and the next volume, Pax Britannica, the name by which the trilogy as a whole is known, is wow. The scope of expertise and the range of references to obscure facts and astonishing observations is just incredible. Some of us have a picture of non-fiction writing as the process of gathering dots of information and then linking those dots in interesting ways. Morris does that in a remarkable way, and back in the analog age, just astonishing. Well, that's it for another month's reading. I'll try to post these videos in a more timely fashion in future. Please let me know if you have any questions about these books, or indeed my book, A Place of Our Own, 6 Spaces That Shaped Queer Women's Culture, out in paperback in the UK on June 5th, by the way. The comments are a great place to ask them. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.